When Brooklyn and I married, I never thought his son would be the one to unnerve me. I was 44 at the time, still sharp in my suits, the kind of woman who could silence a boardroom with a single glance. Brooklyn adored that about me. My poise, my fire, my discipline. I was his contrast. His cure for a life that had grown too gray and predictable. Julian had been 15 then. We met on a quiet spring afternoon in the courtyard of the country club. I remember the way he looked at me, then just a boy but with eyes that held something older, something watchful. I was in heels, fresh from a meeting, sipping espresso while Brooklyn introduced me with a hand resting proudly on my back. Julian didn't smile like most teenagers do when forced into pleasantries. He watched every inch of me, measured me. He said, "Hi," in that low, even tone, and I remember thinking, this one's going to be trouble. He never once called me stepmom. 4 years passed in fragments. Brooklyn and I grew into each other with the ease of practiced maturity. He traveled for business. I ran my own company, sleek and fast-moving like the Porsche I kept waxed in the garage. Julian grew up too. Taller, broader in the shoulders, quiet but confident. He never stopped looking at me the way he did that first day. And somewhere between 16 and 18, the difference became unmistakable. He started helping around the house more, offering to carry groceries, fix the stereo, check the locks when Brooklyn was out of town. Harmless things. And yet, he'd linger after dinner. His eyes never quite innocent when he asked how my day had been. There were glances, compliments, wrapped in casual tones but never careless. "You know," he said once, leaning against the kitchen counter, a smirk ghosting the corner of his mouth, "you look better in that blazer than the models I see on Instagram." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not the way I wanted to. I simply raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Don't go there." But I saw the flicker of challenge in his eyes. The spark of a boy who had become a man, and knew it. When he turned 18, something shifted. He didn't flirt anymore. He made intentions known. One morning I was leaving for a conference in San Francisco. It was early, just after 6, and the house was still and dark, bathed in the gray light of dawn. Julian was up though. Shirtless, barefoot, sipping coffee like he'd been waiting. "You're not really going to drive all that way alone, are you?" he asked. I smoothed my coat, pretending not to notice the way his gaze followed my movements. "I'm not made of glass, Julian." "No," he said, his voice slower. "You're made of steel. And porcelain." That was when I knew it had to stop. Or at the very least it couldn't be allowed to begin. Because I wasn't just Alice, the woman in the Porsche. I was Alice, his father's wife. And even if I hadn't birthed Julian, even if I hadn't raised him, there was a line. A sacred, necessary line. But he didn't believe in lines. Or maybe he just believed he could cross mine. That summer, Brooklyn traveled more than usual. Julian had graduated and was taking a gap year to figure things out, which meant he was always home, always in my space, always watching. One evening we were both in the garage, me organizing old paperwork from the car, him pretending to fix a shelf that didn't need fixing. The door was half open, the golden light of dusk filtering through like some scene in a forgotten film. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Why do you always run?" he asked. I glanced over my shoulder. "Excuse me." From me. "You see it too." "I know you do." I closed the folder in my hands and stood slowly, letting silence fill the space between us like a fog. "You're 19. And you're not just my stepmother." "Exactly," I snapped. "I'm your stepmother. By law," he said, voice calm. "But that's never what I saw when I looked at you." He took a step closer, then another. My breath caught, not from fear, not even from surprise, but because a part of me, the part one buried deep beneath layers of propriety and self-control, wanted to hear what he'd say next. "You know what I saw?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "I saw the woman I wanted to be near. The one who never needed anyone but made people want to be needed. You are everything I ever wanted." And then, with the air thick between us, he added, "I just never knew wanting someone could feel this much like home." Closed my eyes. Because for a second, for one dangerous, unguarded second, I felt the same. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I only opened the door wider and stepped into the night. Heels clicking on the pavement, the weight of my decision dragging behind me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. It began with a lie I told myself. That it would be just that once. That I could control it. That I was still in charge of my own boundaries. The night it happened, it was raining. One of those late summer storms that rolls in without warning, thrashing the windows and painting the sky in electric flashes. Brooklyn had called earlier to say his flight was delayed. He sounded tired, distracted. I told him I'd wait up, though we both knew I wouldn't. Julian had been quiet all evening. I found him in the den, sprawled across the couch, a book resting forgotten on his chest. He looked up when I entered, and there was something different in his eyes. Not flirtation, not teasing. Stillness. Intention. "I made tea," I said, already regretting the softness in my voice. He watched me carefully, like I was a puzzle he had finally figured out. "You okay?" I nodded, brushing invisible dust from my sleeve. "Just tired. Of pretending." That stopped me cold. I turned toward him too fast, too sharply. "Don't," I said. "Not tonight." But he stood anyway, moving toward me slowly, like I was a flame he knew would burn him and still needed to touch. "I don't want to pretend anymore," he said. "And neither do you." His fingers were warm when they touched mine. Barely a graze, but it undid me more than any kiss could have. I didn't pull away. I should have. I wanted to. And yet I stood there motionless until his other hand cupped my jaw and he kissed me. Softly, reverently, like a confession whispered into the dark. And I kissed him back. It was slow, aching, as if we both knew we were standing on something that could collapse beneath us at any second. When we finally pulled apart, I didn't say a word. I just left the room, my pulse loud in my ears, my hands trembling, my mouth still burning with the taste of him. 4 days afterward, I avoided him. I left the house early, took longer meetings, drove aimlessly through winding roads just to escape my own thoughts. And Julian, he didn't push, he didn't chase, he let me run. But there were moments, quiet, unbearable moments, when our eyes would meet across the room, and I would feel the gravity of him all over again. I told myself it was over. A mistake. A moment of weakness. Then it happened again. And again. We never talked about it. Not really. Not in words. But it was there. In the way his hand would brush against mine in the kitchen, lingering just long enough to remind me of what we weren't supposed to want. In the way I'd find him leaning in the doorway, watching me like I was some myth he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to believe in. There were nights I'd wake up breathless, my dreams soaked in the memory of his touch, and I would hate myself. I'd shower until the water ran cold, as if it could strip me clean of whatever this was. But when morning came, I'd still feel it clinging to me, this wrongness that didn't feel wrong when I was with him. One evening, I sat alone in the backyard, a glass of wine cradled in my hands. The sky was soft and gray, the air thick with the scent of gardenias. He found me there. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice barely above a murmur. I didn't look at him. I stared at the pool instead, the faint shimmer of the water reflecting back something I couldn't name. "I try to," I admitted. "But it doesn't stick." He sat beside me without asking. We didn't touch. Didn't speak for a long time. "You've always been so far away," he said eventually. "Even when you're in the room." I laughed. Quiet and bitter. "That's how I survive. You don't have to do that with me." But I did. And he knew it. Because every time I let myself get close, I pulled away twice as hard. There was a part of me that craved his presence. The way he looked at me like I was still vibrant, still desirable. Like I hadn't faded with time or become just another accessory to Brooklyn's life. But there was also the other part, the woman who stared at herself in the mirror and whispered, "This is wrong. You know better." And I did. But knowledge doesn't keep you from falling. It only makes the landing more painful. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything almost came crashing down. Brooklyn had returned unexpectedly from a weekend conference. I heard the front door open while Julian and I were still in the kitchen. Too close, too comfortable, too exposed. Julian had just tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers brushing the edge of my cheek like a secret. We froze. Brooklyn's voice called from the foyer, cheerful, oblivious. "Alice. Jules." I pulled away like I'd been burned. Julian stepped back without protest. I composed myself in seconds, pushed my hair behind my shoulders, reached for the coffee mug, as if caffeine could mask the weight of what we'd almost been caught in. When Brooklyn entered the room, He kissed my cheek and ruffled Julian's hair. And I smiled. I smiled like I hadn't been a breath away from ruin. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my bed, still dressed, still undone. Julian texted me once. I didn't mean to get too close. I don't know how to stop. I stared at the message for a long time. And then I turned off my phone. Because I didn't know how to stop either. But I knew I had to try. I made them. And I broke every one. After that night, I tried again to build a wall between us. Something permanent, something cold and tall and rational. I scheduled more out-of-town meetings. Filled every spare moment with clients and colleagues and conferences. My assistant thought I was preparing for a promotion. Brooklyn thought I was chasing some new account. No one thought I was running. Except Julian. He didn't text again for weeks. He didn't seek me out or linger in doorways like before. He didn't offer his subtle, reverent touches. But the silence between us was louder than anything either of us could say. And it hurt more. Then came September. The end of summer lull that hangs in the air like a farewell. The house was quiet again. Brooklyn off on a 2-week real estate trip in Denver. The stillness clawed at my ribs. I came home one evening later than usual. The headlights of my Porsche sweeping across the driveway. Julian's car was there, but the lights inside were all off. I told myself not to care. Told myself to go straight to bed. Instead, I found him in the living room. On the floor, headphones in, eyes closed, head leaning against the couch. He looked peaceful. And heartbreakingly young. I should have walked away. I should have let him be. But I didn't. I sat on the armrest just above his shoulder. He didn't move. Not even when I brushed a hand across his temple, tucking back that familiar lock of hair. His eyes opened slowly, meeting mine without a trace of surprise. "I thought you were avoiding me," he said. "I thought you were giving up." He shook his head gently. "Never. Was. You've been good," I said quietly. "I've been patient." There was something devastating in his voice, something raw and steady, like he had already accepted the price of this thing between us. And in that moment, I realized something I'd been too proud to admit. I wasn't strong enough to stay away. Not anymore. We didn't kiss that night. We didn't even touch. We just sat there in the dark, shoulder to shoulder, as the weight of what we were doing pressed down on both of us. The affair didn't resume in a blaze. It wasn't urgent or wild. It was quieter than that. Slower. Like the kind of fire that simmers, the kind you don't notice until you're standing in the center of it, surrounded by smoke. He would come into my study late at night, claiming to look for a book. He would bring me tea I didn't ask for. I would catch myself brushing lint from his shirt just a second too long. It was small things, but they grew. One night, I found him in the kitchen again, leaning barefoot against the counter, a glass of milk in his hand like some echo from childhood. He was wearing a white t-shirt and gray sweats, and I remember thinking how unfair it was, how he could make something so simple look like a confession. He looked up as I entered. "You're not sleeping either," he said. "I haven't been sleeping for a long time." Julian watched me for a beat, then set his glass down. "Come sit," he said gently. And I did. We sat on the floor like teenagers, backs against the cabinets, knees bent, quiet between us again. "You still think this is a mistake?" he asked, voice almost a whisper. I stared at the floor. "I think it's 1,000 mistakes strung together. And I think I can't stop." There was a pause before he said, "Do you want to?" I turned toward him slowly. "That's not the question that matters, Julian." "Then what is? Can we survive it?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because the truth was we didn't know. The risk wasn't just being caught. It was what it was doing to me. To him. To the silence that came every time I was alone again, and my conscience came crawling out of its cage. I began to hate mirrors. I stopped wearing perfume when I knew he was home. Still, the affair deepened. One night, in the soft glow of the hallway light, I passed by his bedroom. His door was ajar. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, hands tangled in his hair, elbows on his knees. His breath was uneven. "Julian." He looked up quickly, startled. "Sorry. I didn't think you were still awake. What's wrong?" He hesitated, then said, "This is getting harder, Alice." I stepped into the room without thinking. I shouldn't have. The air between us had thickened again, heavy with all the things we refused to name. "I don't know how to be around you without wanting more," he said. "And I know you're scared. I know you're trying. But I see it. Every time you walk away, every time you make yourself smaller, I feel it." His voice broke slightly, and it broke something in me. "I just want you to be real with me." I stood there, frozen. Then I crossed the room. I took his face in my hands. And I kissed him. Not out of lust. Out of grief. Grief for the people we used to be. Grief for the woman I couldn't seem to be anymore. I pulled back and whispered, "This isn't forever." He nodded. "But it's now." And so we stayed, locked in that moment, knowing we had crossed the point of return. Knowing love was never supposed to feel like this. But feeling it anyway. The mornings were the hardest. They felt like glass, clear, cold, and ready to shatter. In the light of day, all the softness from the night before was gone. What lingered instead was guilt. And guilt was heavier than any lie. Julian would avoid me on those mornings, even if we were alone in the house. He'd keep his distance like he knew I needed space, as if stepping too close might make me say the thing neither of us wanted to hear. "This has to end." But he was also the only one who ever looked at me like I wasn't vanishing. Brooklyn returned from Denver with a gift, a silver necklace in a navy velvet box. His way of saying he'd been thinking of me. And I smiled. I wore it. I let him kiss my cheek. But every time his hands lingered on my waist, my skin would flinch beneath the surface, not because I didn't love him in some way, but because I knew I wasn't his anymore. Not entirely. And it was killing me. Julian kept his promise. He didn't press. He never asked for more than what I offered. But sometimes he'd pass me in the hall and glance over his shoulder like he could still feel the heat from that first night. And sometimes I'd catch him in the mirror behind me, watching the way I pulled my hair back or smoothed my blouse, and I'd feel that knot in my chest tighten again. One night we crossed a new line. Brooklyn had gone to sleep early, tired from a long day of meetings. I was in the kitchen finishing some emails when Julian came down the stairs, barefoot, his sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just walked up behind me and rested his hand gently at the small of my back. Just his palm, warm, steady, heartbreakingly intimate. It wasn't about seduction. It wasn't about sex. It was the kind of touch you give someone you ache for, someone you can't have but can't leave. And I leaned into it. Just for a second. Then I whispered, "You need to go upstairs." He didn't move. "Julian," I said again, my voice breaking. "Please." He stepped back slowly. "I'm sorry." I turned, and for the first time in weeks, I saw tears in his eyes. He left without another word. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch in my robe, watching the stars dissolve behind the slow gray rise of morning, my heart pounding with the weight of 1,000 forbidden truths. I thought of every decision that brought me here. How I married a man I respected, not craved. How I stepped into a family, only to find myself drawn to its youngest member like a moth to a flame that wasn't mine to touch. And I thought of Julian. His words, his silence, his hands that never asked for anything but never had to. I thought of how much I wanted to tell him that I wasn't sorry. That I had felt more alive in the few stolen moments with him than I had in the last decade of my carefully measured life. But I couldn't give him more. Not without breaking everything. So I made a choice. I called a colleague in Seattle. I told her I needed space. Sabbatical, maybe. A project that would give me a reason to leave. Julian was in the garage that afternoon, working on something under the hood of his car. I approached him quietly, my heels crunching against the gravel. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowing slightly when he saw me. "I'm going away for a while," I said, keeping my voice even. He said nothing. I need to clear my head. He folded the rag slowly. Running. No, I said. Saving what's left. His jaw clenched, but his voice was calm. You mean saving him? I shook my head. I mean saving you. From hating me later. From watching this destroy everything good in you. Julian took a step toward me. His expression unreadable. You think walking away erases what we had? No, I said, my voice catching. But it lets us remember it for what it was. Before it became something we had to lie about. He looked at me for a long time. So long that I almost reached for his hand, almost told him to come with me, to let the world burn behind us. But he said only this. I'll wait. Tears stung the corners of my eyes, but I forced myself to smile. Don't. He nodded once. And I walked away. It's been 8 months since Seattle. Brooklyn still thinks it was a burnout. That I needed a change. He doesn't ask too many questions anymore. Maybe he knows. Or maybe he's just grateful I came back at all. Julian's gone now. Moved to San Diego for school. We don't talk. We don't write. But sometimes I think I catch glimpses of him in the young men who walk the sidewalks outside my office. Confident, assured, haunted by things they don't say. And in the quiet moments when the city goes still and my heart feels too loud, I think of him. Not as my stepson. Not as the boy who waited for me in the dark. But as the only person who ever really saw me. And the only one I ever truly wanted to hide from.